in Warsaw. He's a senior fellow with the Centre for European Policy Analysis. Mark, good to have you with us. Are we realistically any closer to a conflict between Russia and NATO, given Russia has said that could happen?
Thank you, Paul. Well, what has transpired, what was recently announced, that is the lifting of this, frankly, ridiculous ban to use Western weapons, in particular American and German weapons against targets on Russian territory, has been long awaited by the Ukrainians, but by many in the West who actually believe that supporting Ukraine to victory, as long as it takes, as the administration has said on multiple occasions, is the only realistic way to preserve peace. I mean, if Russia is allowed to actually penetrate deeper into Ukrainian territory and, heaven forbid, reach the Western borders, which I don't think it will, but still, NATO would end up with a hostile, assertive, aggressive Russia at its border. So what NATO is doing, what the U.S., the Western alliance is doing, is actually, supporting a very vigorously defending Ukraine, which is ultimately it will have to make difficult choices about targeting, Russian forces, Russian formations, Russian depots, Russian assets inside Russia. But it's very much needed because if not, look what happened with Kharkiv. The Russian formations were gathering on the Russian side of the border, and the Ukrainians couldn't touch them. So that was Ukraine fighting with its one hand tied behind its back, I mean, for far too long. So the decision that was announced a couple of hours ago by Ambassador Carpenter from the National Security Council, my former boss at the Penn Biden Center, by the way, was a much applauded decision, I believe, and Ukraine will be able to defend itself and ultimately defend NATO by effectively staving off future such Russian attacks, I would imagine.
So you think the calculation by NATO was correct, that effectively don't take too much notice of Russia saying, this could start a war with NATO?
Well, the Kremlin has been cashing this check, the so-called escalation dominance or escalation recriminations for far too long, too many times. Every time NATO does something to support Ukraine, Russia talks about escalation. Actually, NATO's responses come as a result of Russia's escalatory actions, first and foremost in attacking Ukrainian civilians. But let's remember, Russia also proposed to move the maritime borders of three NATO states in the Baltic region, in the Baltic Sea, that is Finland, Estonia, and Lithuania. Imagine how escalatory that was, in the eyes of the NATO decision makers. It's usually the mirror imaging that the Kremlin is projecting, trying to claim that NATO and the West is doing something that's escalatory. It's actually, usually it comes as a response to some egregious violation, attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure all over Ukraine. So I wouldn't take it too seriously. I mean, there is nothing much more than they can do at this point. Obviously, the tactical nuclear exercises have been used, far too often to try to intimidate both Ukraine and the West. It doesn't work. So it's difficult to imagine what Putin will conjure up this time around.
So it sounds like allowing Ukraine to use NATO weapons on Russian targets, it closes that gap in terms of military capabilities between Ukraine and Russia, but you're still effectively in a kind of, at best, stalemate, and so the conflict continues ad nauseum.
Well, the conflict, nobody can predict how long the conflict would continue, but at least now Ukraine has a fighting chance to actually not allow the Russian forces to launch offensive operations, so especially in the upcoming summer season, whereby they seize more and more territory, which they call a sanitary cordon. And second of all, weapon systems such as the F-16s are coming quite soon, as you know. Imagining that those airplanes will somehow hit the brakes and turn around at the site of the Russian border, I mean, figuratively speaking, that's unrealistic. So, I'm sure the U.S. has given has lifted this ban just in time for Ukraine, for the Ukrainians to be able to use the F-16s at will in the regions that adjacent to the Ukrainian border, but not limited to Ukrainian territory.
Appreciate your analysis, Mark. Thank you so much. Mark Voyger there from the Centre for European Policy Analysis.